What were the exceptions for military service in Israel under the law of Moses? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Deuteronomy on Walking Through the Bible. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Deuteronomy 20. We're going to be reading from verses 1 to 9. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Deuteronomy 20, beginning at verse 1. When you go out to battle against your enemies and see horses and chariots and people more numerous than you, do not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God is with you, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. So it shall be, when you are on the verge of battle, that the priest shall approach and speak to the people. And he shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, today you are on the verge of battle with your enemies. Do not let your heart faint, do not be afraid, and do not tremble or be terrified because of them. For the Lord your God is he who goes with you, to fight for you against your enemies, to save you. Then the officers shall speak to the people, saying, What man is there who has built a new house and has not dedicated it? Let him go and return to his house, lest he die in the battle and another man dedicate it. Also, what man is there who has planted a vineyard and has not eaten of it? Let him go and return to his house, lest he die in the battle and another man eat of it. And what man is there who is betrothed to a woman and has not married her? Let him go and return to his house, lest he die in the battle and another man marry her. The officers shall speak further to the people and say, What man is there who is fearful and faint-hearted? Let him go and return to his house, lest the heart of his brethren faint like his heart. And so it shall be, when the officers have finished speaking to the people, that they shall make captains of the armies to lead the people. Coming to chapter 20, now we're going to be discussing something that hasn't been discussed in any other part of the Old Testament books thus far, and that is Israel's conduct in warfare. Today's lesson will focus on Israel's army itself, while the next lesson will focus on how Israel was to treat other armies. The first thing we see is something that we have discussed before, which is that when Israel went into battle, they weren't to be concerned of the size or the battle readiness of the opposing army, for if God was on their side, they would be victorious. Had Israel remembered this 40 years earlier, which they should have because they had seen what God did for them up until that point, they wouldn't be in the plains of Moab receiving the law for a second time. They would already be in Canaan, with this generation likely living peacefully in the land that God would have already given them. What we see here, though, is that even with God's promise of being with them and providing them victory, that didn't mean that nobody among Israel wouldn't die in battle. God wasn't going to miraculously protect each Israelite in battle from death, but he was going to allow a faithful Israel to defeat a larger army with his help. However, before the children of Israel were to go to battle, they were to call one of the priests to speak to the people. He was to remind them again not to fear the battle, not to tremble before the enemy, for the Lord God would be with them and against their enemies. In essence, then, the priest's task was to remind Israel about God in order to build up their confidence. After that, the army would need to be organized. That task would be up to the officers. If you recall back to Deuteronomy 16:18, officers were to be appointed along with judges in every city. These officers would obviously know everyone who was eligible to go to war, which according to Numbers 1, 2, and 3, was every male over the age of 20 years old. And they would be able thus to call them out to go to war. There were exceptions, though, to military service. The first exception was that if a man had built a new house and had not yet dedicated it, he would be able to return to do so, lest he die and another man dedicate it. What is being talked about here is that someone has purchased a house and has not yet formally taken possession of it by a solemn ceremony followed by a festive entertainment. Since possessions were passed down through male heirs, not actually taking possession of something might make the purchase void, thus costing the man's family some property. So this man was exempt, not forever, but until he had dedicated his new house. The second exemption was for someone who had planted a vineyard but had yet to eat of it. He was allowed to return to eat of his vineyard, lest he die in battle and another man eat of his vineyard. The Hebrew word used here denotes fields used for gardens or orchards, so it wasn't exclusive to vineyards alone, but olive yards and other fruit trees as well. According to Leviticus 19:23, newly planted fruit trees couldn't be eaten of for common food until the 5th year after planting, so this exemption would have applied until then, and he was able to eat of the fruits of his labor. The third exemption involves someone who was betrothed to a woman and has not yet married her. We're going to see more about this in chapter 22, but what we must realize is that in the Hebrew culture, a marriage consisted of 2 parts, betrothal and home-taking. During the betrothal period, a man and a woman were exclusive to one another. They were bound to one another, meaning that they were not free to be courting other people or to have sexual relations with other people. That would be adultery. During this phase, which usually lasted about a year, the bride price would be negotiated. The couple would not live with one another, nor have sexual relations with each other either. Rather, the man would be preparing a home for his bride. When that was done, the bridegroom would go to collect his bride. There would be a wedding feast, and then the marriage would be consummated. Thus, when it came to warfare, it would be a tragedy if a man was betrothed to a woman and he then die in battle before collecting his bride. So an exception was given so that the man could complete the marriage to his betrothed. Further details on this will be given in chapter 24. And then the final exception for military service would be for those who are fearful or faint-hearted. Even though God would be on their side, there was still the prospect of dying in battle, and so there could be some who were afraid. A successful military cannot have people afraid to be in battle, as this fear can be contagious in a sense, thus harming the troops. So God made an exception in this case. None of these exceptions were to be faked by the people, which is why the officers of the towns were selected to organize the army, for they would know the people best. Once those who were accepted from serving were dismissed, then the officers would organize the armies further by selecting captains to lead the regiments of troops into battle. This shows us that even though God was on their side, Israel's armies were still well organized so that the battle could go well. We'll continue with this, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 10 to 20, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.